So why don't we go ahead and get started? We're very pleased to have Randy Goebel with us today. Randy, there's a lot of stories I can tell about Randy, but I won't. I'll just say that he's
Just the best one.
well, probably everyone already knows him based on his work. He's worked in a number of different areas. I mean, there's a lot of work done on visualization of web graphs, for example, is pretty interesting. A whole logic around them, knowledge representation, just a whole plethora of things that he's worked on over the years. Was the chair of the Computer Science Department at the University of Alberta, currently is serving as chair of I-Corps. And we're just very pleased to have him here. He's been here several times, and today he's going to tell us about search engine disruptive ideas, if there are any. And with that, I'll let Randy take it away.
Thanks, Miriam. He said I've done a lot of things. Mostly that's people criticize me for being scattered and unfocused, which I will continue today. So the reason that I'm giving this...
Can we switch to the yellow projector, because the red one in this room shakes a lot. And
Oh, we've tried the yellow one and it's also shaking.
Mayor, on Tech Talk 42 looks like it's open.
I think there's another talk in there. I tried to reserve it before, and it's...
So you want to try?
The yellow's usually better in this room, but...
I think it'll be the same. We tried
Okay, then.
earlier.
So as the disruption is continuing, right?
Okay.
Visual disruption. So the little logo up here says the Alberta is the Texas of Canada. Actually, I'm a Canadian, so I think of Texas as the Alberta of the United States, except we have more oil. And so in my jurisdiction, we spend a lot of money on research. So I'm in a group now that gets a lot of money to do a whole spectrum of research in machine learning. My background is as a formalist, a good old-fashioned AI guy doing knowledge representation. And when I think hard about what happens with search engines, I've tried to think hard about what the disruptive forces are and what some of the approaches to dealing with them are. And you'll see what I think those are. And this is a good place to get it. So motivation and conclusions come first, because if the room gets too full and it's too jittery, then you can see the conclusion and go away and get on with work. You can wait for the videotape version to get the details. Right? But I'm going to largely focus on two things. One is going to be knowledge representation, but in context with communities and culture. Somebody who I was telling about this talk said, "Oh, you can't be a computer scientist with a social conscience." But in fact, maybe I will reveal myself to be that. Let's see.
That was a mathematician,
Yeah.
right?
Good point. I took this diagram from a friend's paper, a recent paper done for telecom laboratories in Germany, it's a little busy, but the reason I like it is that we can think of where we are in the development of the large, broad community of digital information. And what I liked about this is that the European project, sometimes in the newspapers referred to as Euro Google, has split now into two sort of philosophies. One is the French and one is the German. You know what my surname is, so you might know what my preferences are. But on the German version, they're interested in what Wolfgang and Andreas Dengel have called Web 3.0. The real motivation I have is really only two things. And I have to tell you that it might be thought of as democratization of information, but you'll see the Google mantra a little later on. So I'm interested in what it means to move in this direction. And this is just an example and a diagram that helps motivate the idea for moving in that direction. You can see we're not moving in a very steady pace. It's a little jittery, but you'll see. So here's the conclusion. So you'll see these later on. I just want to briefly go over them because what I'm going to claim is that I gave a similar talk this at Google Beijing in October. I told those people that they had the opportunity to rescue Google from a metadata monoculture. And you'll see what I mean by that as I keep talking. And then I do want to talk about the technical architectural impediments and about these notions of digital communities and tracking how they contribute to meaning when you search to retrieve information. Because, of course, I think most of the people here are really smart and they know that when you search, you're not just searching, you're actually augmenting content with semantics. I'll show you some examples, but we'll get past that again. To make this clear, or to try to make it clear, is is you can think of Google or any other search engine as more than a search engine, providing semantics on top of content. And so this is the sort of facetiously thinking you can think about Web 3.0, whatever that is. It's very hard to define. But largely in the technical community of people worried about information retrieval and indexing, it's adding something that allows you to better interpret the content that you're trying to retrieve. I have to tell you that I'm using somebody else's words in doing that because I'm an old-fashioned AI guy. Semantics has a very clear meaning when you talk to a logician about what it means to imbue content or semantic content to syntax. But with that said, that's the point, right? The point is what can you learn about moving in this direction and adding whatever it takes. You can think of it as metadata to start out with, because that's a good, as good analogy in everything as anything, to provide better semantic support for the poor user out there trying to get access. You know, do what I mean is an old acronym from very old days that most of you wouldn't remember as you weren't born then, but the Lisp front end that was called DWIM said, do what I mean when I'm programming. That's another way to think about this. So I had to take out the perfunctory analysis of what I think of as maybe the most brittle kind of way of adding semantics, but you'll recognize this thing from Tim Berners-Lee. I have another version of it from the guys at the German Center for AI Research. So who believes that you can actually engineer semantics in this very, very static, brittle way, that is building the layers and getting to these three things here are the domain of the old-fashioned representation guy. I don't know anybody that believes this in principle, but as a practice of organizing metadata on top of what you do, maybe there's an analogy that allows this. But I'm not sure I believe this, and I'll tell you a few reasons why. One reason is to think about this, is that it's the good old-fashioned knowledge representation, so-called GOFAIR, good old-fashioned AI, has for a long time distinguished between table lookup and search. And in the case where your domain is small enough to build table lookup, so these if-then-else rules, so in a game situation that says, if this is the situation, then do this, you can just look it up, and indexing and retrieval works fine. And you're not changing the semantics of anything when you do table lookup. And you, if you watch the newspapers and you watch the editorials that people write about how Google impacts the world, will be more familiar, perhaps, than me when you read these, to say that there's a certain kind of distortion that comes when you do a whole lot of processing to be able to make choices and decisions about what information to retrieve based on this very simple interface, which skews you in this direction to think about what is the knowledge that I use when I make decisions about what move to make next, at least in this very simple inference environment. And so I want you to keep that in mind, because every time you add a layer or you add something of some algorithmic discipline between the user and the content they're looking for, you're biasing the meaning of the things that you retrieve. And so if you believe that, or even if you understand it but don't believe it, you'll understand all the rest of the things I'm going to give you. This is a cleaned up version of it. In watching the dialogues, I just talked to Peter Norvig, watching the dialogues between Tim Berners-Lee and Peter Norvig, it's very clear that one of the problems with this semantic layer cake is that these two issues are an issue at every level. At every level that you provide the opportunity of some kind of expression of metadata, you provide the opportunity to not get it correct, but the opportunity to have it intentionally wrong. The province of the discipline that I've worked in for many years, knowledge representation, deals with these layers. And I'm afraid that they're not nearly as tidy as they look there in that diagram. So there's a lot to do there. And I'll give you just a few examples to show you what can be disruptive there. But this you can take home as a message, is that these two issues are issues at every level. Every time I write down an annotation in any metadata form, right, I can lie. You may not know, but the first computer system that ever was brought to a halt and crashed using the World Wide Web was a graduate student in engineering at the University of Victoria in Canada who said, wouldn't it be neat to see what happens to the university's computer systems and the web server if I put every word in the English dictionary that has anything to do remotely with sex on a web page and find out what the search engines do? Right? It brought the university to a halt. But that was 1995, so it was in the early days. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's disruptive. You can now go away if you think that these are disruptive. I was going to stroke this one out. Apparently, I can't keep up with Google purchases, so not surprising. But I'll say a little bit about some of these, and you'll see that there's two kinds of challenges here. One is credibility of information. I'll give you an example from this company called Freeload Press. And the last couple of slides I'll show you will be about sensor networks and world dashboards. And what they do is they show you the incredible complexity of the problem of building a view of the world, and see what that looks like. But these are sort of cultural. You'll see some of this. I want to put in a plug for another Canadian. The word cyberspace was first published in print by a science fiction author named William Gibson. You should read this latest book of his. It's near fiction, and it's really about the remix culture. It's a very interesting novel, the same kind of Gibson writing that's like a roller coaster. You have fun along the way. The roller coaster stops, and you go, and you say, oh, what was that all about? But it's an interesting book because it talks about a potential impact of some secret person remixing a whole bunch of things in the internet world and producing something that advertisers are desperately wanting to get a handle on because it's creating such attention in the whole world. So you might look at that book. So now I'm ready to start the talk, right? I want to remind you about what your mantra is, and if it's changed. Canadians coming into this country are always worried about weapons of mass destruction, so I thought that you remember the search for weapons of mass destruction in your pages before. Organize is a very loaded word. Right? And that's part of what this notion of disruption is. And I want to point out to you is that I worked on a project many years ago in Japan. It was called the Real World Computing Project. Mayran has trained me to think about this century as being the century of data and machine learning, and I think he's right. But the conception in Japan in this magnificent 10-year project was the democratization of information along these scales. And if you talk about computing evolution and function extension, the 5th generation computing project led to this one, which was flexible information processing. It was about how to ask for information. So if you like, the semantics of access to information was in the process, not in the secret indexing in the data. To give you an example, some of the things coming out of these projects were things like visual querying, how to separate the background from the foreground, focus on modeling the white in the room so I could find the people instead of focusing on what an image of a person was. So it was a bunch of intriguing and interesting ideas, but the motivation was the democratization of information based on process, not on data, if you like. So this idea is at least related. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, you can see that when this thing came out in 1966, almost killed natural language research in many places. Canada used to lead natural language research in the world because of the bilingual nature of the country and expenditures in research in the early 60s. It kind of died out because of a kind of Canadian conservatism. But this project report talked about the semantic barrier. This is the time when natural language guys were trying to do natural language processing by dictionary lookup. And what I'm telling you is that I think that there are all kinds of semantic barriers. As soon as you think ontologies and the semantic layer cake is buying you a solution, it's like I had the world by the tail and then it started wagging me phenomenon. So we go through these cycles a lot. So this is another one. Here's one that's more recent. So this was in the newspaper on Sunday talking about iBook and the anxiety that some people have in the world. In this case, I think it's clear it was a librarian who talks about whether or not the creation of indices to books that Google might produce for access online would actually help scholars understand, or ordinary people who are just interested in books. So it's the same kind of thing, is that there's all this anxiety about the technologies and tools being used to provide access to information, but they themselves become brittle and fall apart. If you're looking for a punchline, the only one that I'll say is that the only antidote to this really is machine learning applied to large volumes of data, as at least you have control of your bias, if you like. Right? So now I want to go through two phases of things, two sets of examples that have to do with knowledge representation, but actually turn out to be about culture and community. And then some other things that talk about technically slicing up the environment in which we work, which is really about the internet and IP architecture and related things. So here are the ideas. So the first one is to delve very briefly into a highly technical world of knowledge representation. And you'll see what this little funny diagram means. You can think of this as a robot observing snapshots of the world, accumulating information. And the old idea is that you have a state of the world that's a consistent database. Maybe it's some first-order theory. Doesn't matter much what it is, except that it's a formal representation from which you can draw inferences. You might add something to it. In adding something to it, you have several alternatives to take on the world. So if I tell you it's raining outside right now, you might think I'm wacky, but maybe there was a cloud that went by. And then if I tell you in a little while later it's not raining any longer, then you begin to wonder whether I'm a weatherman or an academic, so on. So you accumulate information that goes inside the robot. But if you think about this, the decisions you make might give you a set of alternatives. And one way is to think about collapsing these to one alternative. So if I tell you it's raining, you don't believe me, you store in your mind, this guy's wacky, don't pay attention to him, it's not raining even if I left the roof of my car down. Here's an example that there is no known solution for in this thing. It's really simple. So take P and Q to be rich and famous. If you store the fact that somebody's rich and famous and you're told they're not rich and famous, right, so everybody knows enough Boolean logic to know, well, the alternatives then to collapse my database, be conservative about what I throw away, is to say, well, if this person is not rich and famous, maybe they're only famous or maybe they're only rich, but I know I can't have both of them. Now I have a decision. Pick one of these, and if I pick one of them and I'm subsequently told they're not famous, if I pick this path, I get empty, and if I pick this path, they're still rich. The point is that as we accumulate information, we have to be very careful about preserving alternatives in the face of incomplete information. Why is that important here? Well, by the way, there have been technical solutions in the literature about this, even as early as this thing. Another PhD student with me studying non-monotonic reasoning said, oh, it's really easy. What you can do is you can use these higher order logics. Talk about, scope. And say that no matter what you know, what is implied by what you know depends on context. So you can look at this paper. It's a highly technical paper. Nobody in their right mind would sit down and read it for bedtime reading unless you wanted to put yourself asleep by the first 4 sentences. But it is a technical solution. And when you think about what this means in higher order logic, it comes down to culture, context, and trust. And that's what I'm going to show you. By the way, Google does pay attention to time sometimes, but only in this way. Right? This is an issue of time, of temporal indexing and representing ambiguity. And another way to think of ambiguity is that it arises in lots of different ways. So many of you will be familiar with this guy, but what you won't know is that he copied a lot of ideas from this guy. There's a young Dutch mathematician who, at age 18, started drawing as many impossible diagrams as he could. This is one of them, right? So here is a representation of something that captures ambiguity directly. And we're actually going to have to understand that if we're going to provide semantics for the world. So that's an example of these things. So let me keep going. Here's another one. So now what I'm doing is I'm just giving you examples of places of things that must be captured and are captured. And what they do is they distort our view of the world that says, I can issue a query term and get the right answer. And if I just work hard enough, I'm going to get the right answer. And I can refine it, and I can hone it, and I can use the best statistical methods in machine learning. But if you don't admit that the world's ambiguous and that you represent ambiguous things, you're kind of doomed to get it wrong in some way. So here's another one, artist's conception, right? We have all of these things in the world, many of them. You can watch these guys go. So this is from IBM, trying to tell you how these carbon monoxide molecules move in a circuit. I don't have to belabor you with that, but here, that's the artist's conception. Here's the real thing. This is from a scanning tunneling microscope that shows benzene moving. And in the visualization work that we do, we try to pick vocabularies, visual vocabularies, that emphasize the properties that the physicist is looking for, not the person reading Scientific American. And the bias is different. It's the same underlying principle, but different vocabularies for expressing different things. Another aspect of representation. So here's another one that you can try. So here's looking for the word wunderbar, one of my favorite German words. And so this one is searching only in Deutschland. And you can see what happens here, what we get. Here's searching for wunderbar in the AmericanContext.com. First thing you get is an advertisement for beer taps, right? That tells you something a little bit about culture. You can't ignore the fact that what you retrieve and what you type in and what it means is culturally dependent. Right? We all know that. I use different search engines depending on what I'm looking for in the world, for example. And here's another one that you might recognize. So there's a bar in this area of Tokyo called Gotanda. I don't think I actually, maybe one of the few bars in Tokyo that I haven't been at. Now, how are we going to solve this problem? When I was here in August, Louis Venan gave this great talk, and I couldn't help but recall what he said. I said, and some people are playing ESP for 60 to 70 hours a week. Whoa, I don't know who those people would be. But here's my reaction, is somebody, if you use the data that those people playing 60 to 70 hours a week are using, is they are defining the semantics of the images that I use your image search engine to retrieve. And I don't like that very much. I like to have more control over how meaning arises. And to give you an example, most of you know about ESP, I'm sure, right? Anybody not know about this game, about the collaborative labeling? So it's a way of getting somebody to work for free. So ESP is a game. You go online, you retrieve images from the web, anything that you can distinguish as an image. Two people play unknown to each other, and they try to collaborate to label the image without using the taboo word. So you can't write chart and pie, and you win. There's a notion of competition. You win because the more quickly you collaborate to get the same words. It's a really clever idea, and it can apply in lots of areas. And this isn't the first person to do it, but this one captured the attention of many people, including Google. But now, here, let me do this. I did this in Google Beijing. So I want you to play the game with me. Here's the character I'm going to present you with. You tell me what it means. Right now, as I look around in the spectrum of this room, I see one guy who I know very well, right, who is a great scholar, who comes from the People's Republic of China, speaks Chinese pretty well, built one hell of a Chinese parser. Right? So he's going to have an advantage over many of us about playing the ESP game when the game is labeling Chinese characters. And I'm going to be pretty abysmal at it unless I have at my disposal some kind of dictionary that I can read. So how many people would even venture to guess what that character means? This, by the way, is currently the most complex character in the online Chinese dictionary that's accessible in this way. Anybody want to guess? Who has some notion of being able to parse the subsymbols? Internet? Yeah. It's a diagram of internet connectivity, of visualization. Right? So I had this game from our machine learning group published as a poker program, and I had it as a prize. And in the Beijing office, I said, whoever gets the closest to this gets this. And two guys got pretty close. So tell us what you think it means. Because I have the advantage of having looked it up, right?
Yeah, I think it's a nasal cavity or something.
Yeah, so I'll tell you in a second. Now, one of the things that I'm doing now that I just got a Google grant for is to work with some students on analyzing Chinese compounds, building compound dictionaries for compounds that aren't compositional, so that you need to search through a set of resources to be able to confirm them. But this one is not a Chinese compound. So anybody here is Japanese. So this doesn't occur directly in a Chinese dictionary. It's a little jittery still. But anybody who can read Chinese has an idea about what this means, right? Right? Who knows what this one means?
Woodpecker.
Right, okay. Now, let me tell you what the first one means. So that's the Cantonese, no, sorry, that's the Mandarin pronunciation of something that I got from the people in Beijing. This is what this means. poor enunciation due to snuffle. This is not going to change your life if you don't get this right, but it's an illustration that shows you the context of playing the labeling game without sufficiently paying attention to the cultural contexts. I would rather have somebody Chinese play these games for me. You can do that, by the way, right? Maybe. Okay. Here's another one. This one is really interesting. Cultural context of language. So I got this one from my friend Nakashima 2 weeks ago in Hyderabad. Remember, I don't know if you went to his talk that time, they invited talk. But here's something that's really interesting. Here's what I want you to think about. So the first sentence in Kawabata's Snow Country novel begs the issue. The following issue is I want you to, you don't necessarily have to close your eyes, but think about what you see as an image in your mind when you think about this translation, which has been vetted as an accurate translation of Kawabata's first sentence in this novel. The train came out of the long tunnel into the snow country. So everybody have an image of the train coming out of the long tunnel into the snow country. Right, watch this. So this Japanese scholar, studying how people think about this, right, has proposed the hypothesis by interviewing people and talking about it. This is what the Japanese think about, and this is what us, well, I'm personally a grain-fed prairie white boy, but this is what he claims we tend to think about. Another stark distinction in how one thinks about these things culturally. Now the claim is that the semantics of what we retrieve, that's my hypothesis, has to do with all of this context put on top of the content that we have. Can we figure out how to use that and exploit it and distinguish it is the question. So let's keep going. Now, Peter asked me when we came in, he said, what's the answer? I said, trusted digital communities. So here's the answer. And I'll give you some ideas about how to identify these just from what I've learned in thinking about them and talking to people. So if there is such a thing as a trusted digital community, if you could delimit one, it would tell you something about the meaning of the information that it has a perspective on. You already see this. Google's famous for translations between English and Arabic, and there has to be a belief that what you read and translate from an Arabic newspaper might have a slightly different opinion about a perspective on something than in the English newspaper, for example. So how are you going to measure what's happening in those communities? How are you going to identify them? I want to give you one idea that I get from people who teach language. It's so-called authentic material. I'll say a little bit about that and then just say that identifying communities, drawing inferences from them, and tracking their evolution is interesting. There are some extremely precise, concrete examples. I'll give you some of those. But here's something about the language learning community. If you talk to somebody who teaches people how to teach language, the most successful teachers of a second language deliver graduated contexts to students and say, in the simplest context, here is authentic material in that context that allows you to move forward in, for example, developing vocabulary. So you have levels of learning, and this notion of authentic material is important. So in my backpack, I have a newspaper that comes from Hyderabad. Why is that important? Because the way language is used there is different than the way you use language in the Palo Alto Daily. Right? Trust me, it's just different. So when people are learning language in jurisdictions, having authentic material helps define the community they're trying to become a member of. Now, can you think of a digital community where there is a precise event or object that defines that community? I'll show you some, but just start thinking about that. There's not just authentic material, but authentic processes and authentic events. And I'll show you examples of one. How can you track them? What does it mean to do that? This comes from a woman I know who speaks 9 languages and is busy always trying to build these models of how to track people through language learning, and that's where I got the idea of authentic material. These are just a couple more places you can leave. You can look at this talk and get this. I guarantee you that the version you'll get online will be less jittery than the one that you see here. So here's one. Here's what I would say as an authentic community. It's really hard to figure out how, when I buy a book on Amazon, confirm my purchase, charge my credit card, how that's not an authentic event. It's a confirmed event in a community that I'm willing to allow the use of to make recommendations. I actually don't have much control over that, in a sense. But it's a notion of an authentic community. It's definable. You can track it. You can draw inferences from the community that creates it. And you can identify whether you're part of the community or not. So that's a really, really simple one. The more interesting ones are, of course, much less easy to identify. Can you derive measures of stability in Wikipedia that will tell you something about when you're approaching, even in the most abstract sense of machine learning in the limit, when the data is stabilizing enough so you should at least believe it arises from a community which has vetted it by more than one person, right? So you can watch, it would be interesting to track wiki page changes, Wikipedia page changes, and look at people carrying on a debate about the truth of this thing. The last one I also claim is a phenomena of a digital community. So you may not, maybe some of you don't remember this, but OpenText was a Canadian corporation, the University of Waterloo where I was, that built search engines and search documents. When it was revealed then, back in the late 90s, that they were actually gerrymandering the retrieval because of people paying them for rankings, right? They lost credibility. I don't think that they exist anymore as an open search engine kind of thing. They lost too much. Would that happen with Google today? I'm not sure. It's hard to tell. It's just a different kind of community. So this is an example of a trusted community. That's what happens when I confirm authentic events. They're real. They can't be spoofed, right? If they're spoofed, somebody's using my credit card and I do what I can as quickly as I can about the identity theft. So it's just a really simple example to try to get you to think about that evolution. Here's another one. So I got this from Guha. I'm disappointed that when it searched for material on artificial intelligence, didn't get the textbook that I compete with Peter Norvig for, but you know, that's something, maybe I can pay somebody right now money. So when I search for this, I get this. Right, so I get lectures, assignments, and references, but how is it that I get these and not others? It's the mystery of how the thing was created underneath, and I'm sure there's some coherence to it, but it's another example of a community over which I have little control, that exists, that's defined somehow, that you can think about its value. I wanted to put this one in here because Google has become a verb in some sense. Here's another one that a small company I'm trying to help get some traction is doing, called Freeload Press. So their business model is this, is they go to authors who are producing books, maybe second editions of books, and say, we're going to pay you whatever you thought you would get from your original publisher, but we're going to take your book and we're going to give it away for free online because it hits a mass market at lots of US colleges. And then they insert advertising into it. The students get the books for free. They can even print them for the cost of printing. And you might think the first reaction from most people is, oh my God, insidious advertising in between Lemma 1 and Lemma 2. It's not quite that way, but the idea is that there's another opportunity to build a community, and it's a very interesting one. So here's an example in this particular algebra book, which I'm thinking about the algebra of eigenvectors these days. I have to read more of. So anyway, this is the chapter starting with linear equations, and this is the advertising on the next page that gets stuck in. This is a book. So there's an attempt to stick in the advertising, recover the cost for the author, and give away the textbook for free, but it's also introducing a certain kind of bias and building a certain kind of community. As far as I know, Google hasn't bought this company yet. But, you know, I haven't read the newspapers for almost a half an hour. Now, ideas about how to deal with these communities are kind of interesting, because here's one that I constructed because there are two sliders that I've heard people talk about which bias retrieval of the metadata in a community, right? So here's the Randy's fabricated slider. You can tell which interface it uses. So one comes from Yahoo Mindset that you've probably seen. Another one comes and was spoken of at Microsoft Research Seminar, which is local global. Microsoft didn't like it very much when I pointed out that it was N years since Google produced desktop search for Mr. Gates software, and they still haven't quite got there yet. So I haven't been invited back to Microsoft since, by the way. But there's a slider. So you can imagine a whole notion of like graphic equalizers on dimensions in these communities that I take control of as a user and bias the use of the metadata that's put in there. If I told you that I knew how to do it, I'd be lying. I actually don't think anybody knows how to do it. But the idea is to be able to first acknowledge that there are those communities, use the strongest of them where you can actually have this kind of, for example, access. But one that we're working on that we haven't said much to is I've just pulled out this thing. It's kind of hard to see, but you can imagine we're doing some work on incremental search. That is, use any old API of any old search engine company, retrieve far too much, and then use local information and local data about the structure of knowledge you're looking for. So you don't have a slider, but you have a hierarchical organization of data. One of the guys that's working with me, a guy named Christoph Ringelstetter, comes from a group in Munich. And what some of the things that they've done is build some really interesting custom local knowledge about, for example, hotels in Germany. How many of you have used a search engine to try to find a phone number for a hotel? Right? Yeah. How do you penetrate all of those resellers? Right? It's really a difficult job. So you can think about this. In that case, it's a practical application, doing sort of genre classification of information, using it locally and moving through it as a hierarchy or something else, not just a slider. All of these rely on what I would call some sort of identified, trusted communities. So that's the only thing. Remember, I started out with knowledge representation and got to those sliders. That's sort of the really fast tour through that kind of thing. Now, let me say a little bit about things that are a little more technical in the sense that as a search engine company, no search engine company I know has a lot of control over changes in the broad architecture of the internet. And it's changing, and you find subsets of it you can't have access to. If you have private nets, you have the whole spectrum of how things change. And that just provides another semantic challenge. How are you able to build the metadata and instrument access to those things where they add value and provide access to information? So here's just a few things to talk about before I go on with this. This is just from a recent talk from Sestini at this meeting about the future internet. These are his identification of things that can change how you can index and retrieve things. And they're pretty technical. Right? They don't rely on any abstract, ephemeral notion of trusted digital community where you have to pick what it means to be trusted, you have to pick what it means to be an authentic event, you have to pick what it means to delimit the community. But they're just structures in the network that might provide interesting challenges to doing this. So let's look at, this is just a picture I've used here before in a previous talk. If you know what the jurisdiction you're working in is, you can get this. So this is just something that I've used before to say if you have a jurisdiction server and you control the jurisdiction you're working in. So if I'm a company and I buy one of the Google servers to organize my data inside, I have this sort of carte blanche to organize all of the data in there. And I can do a lot of really interesting things, and not just the user data and the queries and the content and the metadata, a whole spectrum of things. And we've done some things like this, trying to do navigation compression that is looking at weblogs, parsing them, seeing what improvements you get. This is some things that we've done and then visualize them because we're working on big data spaces. You can do this when you have control over the space. If you don't have control over the space, right, you can do much less. And in fact, not having control over a space that changes can be disruptive to you building metadata that's trying to understand it. So there are lots of places that data can arise. You're starting to see, for example, telephones in Europe, which may soon be available. North America is kind of backwards compared to Asia and Europe in that way. Is buy a telephone that, maybe Apple's iPhones will do this when they come out. Buy a telephone that uses both 802.11 and CDMA and GSM. And it swaps around and moves around. It creates at least 3 subnets of exchanging data that are really hard to track. Some companies actually can't charge you properly for those things. There's a story about the US GTE phone nets. It took them 6 months of free calls before they actually got the charging right. If you can't get the charging right, believe me, you can't track the data right either. So here are some examples that you're probably familiar with that change the shape of the data that you can look at. If you like, they use the tools that already exist to provide a different perspective on the data. So I told you about this vertical search engine with the German hotel information. And it's claimed that these are like that. So here's one that everybody's seen. It's one of the first ones that you might remember. And so I was being a little facetious. So this plots all of the I've filtered crimes in Chicago. So this is looking for crimes that happened in a church, synagogue, or place of worship that were associated with criminal transmission of HIV in all districts from November 2nd, 2005 to December 4th, 2006, between one midnight to another. Right? As you can imagine, there's not a lot of activity on this graph. Right? Here's another one. Convenience store burglary, on the other hand, is much different. Right? Now, that's pretty highly cultural, right? What that means and what you expect when you see that and what I told you about it, I biased as broadly as I could to say, oh yeah, this audience would understand that. That might not make sense in some other jurisdiction or context. Yet another example where you have to worry about semantics. Now, the last example I want to give you comes from connecting humans and machines to sensor networks. So one of the reasons that we're interested in this in our machine learning group is that if you deploy 1 million carbon nanotubes generating carbon fluxes and you want to sample the health of a forest, you have to be able to have a model of data economy. So we use, for example, a reinforcement learning model that says which pieces of data are most important at what time over some time spectrum to give you the right sample. But that's just another information processing task. Right? It's another indexing search task because how many people have looked at Pete's Pond in Botswana? Nobody's looked at Pete's Pond? Pete's Pond is, well, good. So Pete's Pond is it's some quite good cameras and sound on a watering hole in Botswana in Africa. You can use it at night because the sound is so good that it sort of lulls you to sleep, right, if you're halfway around the world in a different time zone. But how do you interpret that? Right? There's a lot of data there that can be biased. So there's a guy down the road at Stanford, you probably know Leonis, who says that what we need is an architecture in the same way we've got a semantic layer cake. We're waiting for the semantic layer cake for sensor networks. That's going to drive a bias and a way that you retrieve information because you should be able to say in some kind of query language, show me the last 4 wild goats that came and took a drink at this Pete's Pond in Botswana. Right? But you need a coherent architecture to do that. That's one proposal for it. Here's another one. How do you provide coherent access? This is from FluxNet, which is both across North America and Europe. But this is what you get in you can see that there's a Microsoft influence in how this chart is done. But here's the data that gets retrieved, and you're going to introduce bias every time you try to build metadata on this to understand it. The last one that I want to use is one I'm proud of because there's a project called Neptune, which is just another data source. Right? Just another big complex data source that you should be able to query and think about how you query and what happens in between the data source. And so this one, Neptune, is for instrumenting the west coast of North America, putting in all of these sensors and building something whose artist's conception is like underwater labs. This is one of the rare cases where Canadian funding is ahead of the American funding. So it's Canadian, you know, we feel like we're so small we have to point out these things. But there's the most complex data source that I know. And the question is, how are you going to identify communities and metadata that allow you to query this? Because it's public information. Right? You want uniform access to this within a fabric of a digital community and know which one you're looking at. So that's the last one. Now, this is just the same slide as before. I guess if I was paying attention, I would have taken this one out and you'd have seen progress during my talk. But it's not that dynamic. So here's what I think of as the sort of some of the challenges for Google. The last one is one that it turns out that you're powerful enough and rich enough to start buying things if they seem disruptive. That's as good a way as dealing with disruption as anything. One of the most dangerous things in that semantic layer cake is fraud. And as I've said before, if there's a punchline, is that creating metadata with machine learning is probably the only antidote to sort of moderating the naive construction of the semantic layer cake. I'm willing to answer questions about all the rest of this, and I don't know if there's anything else. Here's the summary that you saw earlier. So the summary really includes these two pieces. One is the connection with community and culture to knowledge representation, which is not a solved problem. There are lots and lots of things yet to be dealt with. The other one is keeping track of shifts in how these communities form as the architecture of the internet changes. And so two solutions. One is to identify authentic events, use machine learning to understand where the boundaries of communities are. When somebody issues a query, say, which community are you interested in the answer from? Or here are two solutions. This is what this community thinks. This is what this community thinks, for example. So I think that's about it. Yeah.
Validated monoculture.
Think about the ESP game, the one for the collaborative labeling. I suspect, and of course I have no way of doing. There is a method you could imagine of identifying where the communities are that are playing that game reside, and then start to think about partitioning them somehow. But if you don't, it's kind of like a monoculture labeling those images. So if I'm sitting there using image search that has been constructed by a monoculture, I'm going to get really frustrated because what I think of when I search for a particular word, I'm not going to get back the results I expect. So it's the effect of a monoculture, but finding those monocultures is not easy. But you have the data to at least start to do that. So if you look at when Mehran shows the new visitors the visualization of the languages and the query activity on the globe that you come in, right? You even have that data to help identify things and then start to look for differences between those communities. So distinguish them culturally. So it's not complicated, not a complicated concept, but it can be an insidious one, right? I don't like watching CNN, and when I'm in Canada, I turn on our CNN, CBC, right? It's sort of like cultural diversity, if nothing else, right? To be diplomatic about that. So that's what I mean by sort of the monoculture problem. I told the guys in Beijing that they were a significant part, with that example, of making Google a worldwide company, not a Mountain View company, for example. Yep.
In some sense, part of the story you're telling is kind of a well-known story.
Yep.
So, for example, medical data
Yep.
really goes through these enormous transformations because nobody dies of apoplexy anymore.
Right.
Nobody dies of dyspepsia. But
Yep.
those were legitimate causes of death 100 years ago.
Right.
And we got those data sets going all the way back. And so the question really becomes, as we continue this forward,
Yep.
subject to changes in semantic, interpretation
Yes.
drift and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Mechanisms for dealing with that, other than sort of social networks that are dynamic and local cultures of interpretation? Or
It's a really good question because one of the ideas that I sort of rebel against is the we're working on an ontology and we haven't quite got it right yet. And what I'm saying,
you never get it right.
no, and my argument is you don't get it right, but what you've said is that you must track those changes. Right? So you must learn to build tools that say, here's how the meaning of these things have shifted over time. Find milestones of shift. And for example, when you talked about apoplexy and dyspepsia, oh, these are not serious diseases anymore. Here are milestones that say we understand them. It changed the culture of how we refer to them and integrate them into medical practice, for example. So I think that that's important. We can't do that with the massive volume of data we have without using some kind of at least simple machine learning to do classification and look for distinctions between histories of data. That's why I put up the little thing with Google Trends, said, that there is the start of something there that talks about temporal indexing, but it's temporal indexing over vocabulary change, for example. I think that's really important to watch for milestone changes.
That's sort of the easy case in some sense. I mean, the harder case is, there are still countries in the world where people do not die of AIDS.
Yeah.
Because that's not allowed in this country. Right.
Yeah, it's even more complicated.
Problem.
Yeah.
So that's a more
Yes.
difficult problem.
We've seen that transition in South Africa from the it doesn't exist and to maybe it does exist. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think you're right. Those are really challenging problems, and the reason that I tried to make them as simple as I did is I'm trying to connect them to my technical background in representation, saying what can I do and to provide tools that will allow me to start tackling some of these really tough problems. I want to look at broad temporal databases and isolate change in them that's based on those kinds of things, for example. And I think if we can't do that, we're kind of lost at building up that semantic layer cake. That's the hypothesis anyway.
So one question along those lines, I mean, there's,
Yep.
from when you're talking about being situated in a particular culture, there's both the data that you have that you're going to potentially do some learning from,
Yes.
as well as what you're trying to infer from the user.
Yes.
And so part of it is, it seems like the user can also be, depending on the culture, right? So at one level, we're in the United States, so from a language bias, that's one thing. But then if you go into the cultural differences between someone, say, their upbringing,
Yes.
or their even different regions in the United States.
Yes. Yep.
I guess how do you?
Yeah,
the
how do you
thing is
how do you
there's
account for
many
the
different layers for this, and
Absolutely
how do you
true.
hope to be able to separate out these layers?
So something that I said nothing about, but that user modeling is, at least to start to, is you model. You're asking the question about the user themselves come from an immersive, some immersion in some culture that you can find distinctions in, right? So you have to model both sides. I think you're right, you have to model both sides. That's tough because we tend to, this is one of the claims I have about the user modeling communities, they tend to overfit. And overfitting means overfitting to an individual, right? It's much better to fit to classes and do that. But you need to find the data boundaries and decide what data you can gather from. So you and I, sitting there, might generate queries that we could eventually distinguish our cultural backgrounds for. But I don't know how to solve the practical security, ethical impediments to do that. But I think that's right. You do that when you click the yes button on any of these websites that you enroll to. That creates an authentic event that puts you in a digital community, right? You have to behave this way in this community. You have to accept all of these terms that flash by and say that. But you also do that in educational context, right? So if you do interactive intelligent computer-aided instruction is maybe what it's called this day, you explicitly subscribe to modeling each individual user, and you look for misfits between how they understand homogenized content. So what if it wasn't homogenized content? And the problem's harder, but I think it's part of the structure that you need to address your issue. It's really hard, right? But you can start. We have all of these tools that we can start with if we only think that it's important to distinguish those cultural communities.
So you had a slide early on where you showed, the growth of the semantic web towards Web 3.0, and
Oh, I see. Yeah, you know.
and the existing relationship between Google or a search engine and a user, and the semantics and this encroaching wall.
Yeah. I know what you mean.
And
So like this, yeah.
When I see this diagram about semantic support, and then I go to the examples you're talking about, your examples seem to be in the form of, I need information that's relevant to me as an individual, to me as a member of the community, to enable the communities to label information. But as far as the semantic support and Web 3.0 are concerned, the problems that I'm hearing you talk about they seem to be much more concrete. I don't have a connection between the problems that you're talking about and why they're semantic support, and why Web 3.0 is, what that even means in a sense, in terms of, we just want our applications to be more related to individuals and to cultures, and to have individuals and cultures contribute to them. Why is semantic support, why is that a semantic problem? As far as the architecture, why is that not just personalizing our online services?
So there's a lot of senses in which I haven't been clear about that connection, so let me try to redress that in the following way. Is that I don't believe this is easy to define, so this is just kind of a caricature of other people saying that, oh, well, Web 3.0 is coming, it's going to solve all your problems with Web 2.0, not knowing that either one of those could be distinguished in any meaningful way. But the notion of semantic support for me isn't in understanding the individual, it's in giving the individual access to and by identifying separate communities to say, I'm searching for something and I have a query language. What is the answer to this query from the perspective of this trusted digital community? So if you like, it's saying that whenever I create an abstraction of data that is metadata, there are different ways of doing it. Be careful to distinguish them so that me as a user can say, what does the Palestinian community think about this issue? So when Mayra and I are talking about the individual and the connection to things, that was going all the way to fitting to an individual user what their view of this data was. I actually don't think that's very useful in this context. What I think is useful is identifying communities which have distinct perspectives on things. So the vocabulary that they use is different. Maybe slightly different. If it's in another language, maybe the translation comes out differently in one query than it does when I type it in the native language, and that gets different kinds of retrieval. So it's having access as a user over here to, not to say, so it was somebody that had left there said that, was talking about multiple communities, that you can't ever get it right. There is no way to simply improve the engineering of an ontology in the semantic layer cake that improves search quality, because there is ambiguity in the content. And so what you want is a different perspective. So I want some kind of way of classifying those communities and saying, I'm asking a question, just give me all the answers. I am really interested in finding out what this kind of community thinks about this. So let me fabricate an example. I want to know what people think about this consumer product. I would like to be able to direct that question filtered from an eBay perspective of articles sold only in the United States, because I suspect that perspective would be different for the same kinds of articles sold elsewhere in the world, for example. So two different communities issue the same query and look and compare the results. So it's not modeling me, it's giving me access to a different perspective on the substrate of data. Does that make sense?
To reformulate what you're saying,
yep.
It's in the existing model, it's the responsibility of a search engine to internationalize, to define communities, to set up the black boxes to which you can go into. And you're saying that you would like to make it possible for users to contribute to the creation of communities that we are
sure.
we are learning through machine learning,
and
then saying, well, I'm a French speaker in California. I'm looking for products related to this, and whereas now you can't do that because it requires someone in Google to have come up with that distinction.
And in fact, I think that there's even a sense in which I think that you're looking at a grander problem. I would just be happy to be able to find simple ways of classifying well-delimited communities so I can at least see them emerge when I make this query. So that's why, remember I had the sliders, but the sliders might be digital, right? They might be really simple. So the local global search thing that Microsoft says, oh, we want to find things in the whole wide world or just on your desktop, or the buy, sell, the buy research thing of Mindset, Yahoo. There's no reason for a slider because you have no idea what it means halfway in between anyway, right? But you want to bias it somehow. And what I'm saying is that I would like to be able to look at the best results of the simplest machine learning tools doing classification on the largest volume of data to draw boundaries between those communities that at least I can faithfully interpret. So it's even simpler than what you said. Your goal is grander and it's more important, but I think that we have the tools to start building those things and finding them. But that's why from this language instruction thing, this notion of authentic material really grabbed me. It grabbed me in the sense that if I can confirm what an authentic event is, in the same way that I can avoid spoofing of IP addresses and people gathering my data, all that other kind of stuff that's highly technical from the communications literature, then I have an attribute that will help me learn that community, if you like. So I think that we have all of those pieces there. What I don't want to do is use a search engine that denies its existence and thinks that if just by working harder in the background and building better inference and better black box structuring of the data, that it's going to get better. So the notion of generic search quality, right, for me it becomes less appealing as the world gets more complicated. So yeah, your description of it is what I think, but it's grander, so you have a tougher time achieving it. Thanks for your attention.